Welcome to our Urban Biodiversity Management Seminar. Since we will not be meeting face-to-face until the 18th of September, I thought it would be useful for me to say a few introductory words in this video. Let us start with a few simple definitions. We should also note that very few of the things worth defining are ever all that simple. That being said, by urban, we generally mean things that are related to, situated, or occurring in, or characteristic of a city or a town, especially as opposed to the countryside. Biodiversity, on the other hand, refers to all those aspects of variability evident within the living world, including diversity within and between individuals, populations, species, communities, and ecosystems. I should pause to note here, biodiversity should not be conflated with species diversity itself. It's not just the richness of species, for instance, because it contains both diverse entities and diverse processes, including, for instance, decay, nutrient cycling, all those ecosystem processes, all the way up to including evolutionary processes and so on. Finally, by management we mean organization, supervision or direction, the application of skill or care in the manipulation, use, treatment or control of a thing or person, or in the conduct of something. One of the reasons why we might be especially interested in ecological management these days derives from the suspicion that we have been mismanaging Earth's resources at local to global scales. This in some ways is the meaning of that term, the Anthropocene, which has been widely used since it was coined around the year 2000 to denote this current geological age in which we live, in which many geologically significant conditions and processes have been profoundly, maybe irrevocably, altered by human activity. So putting these three terms together, urban, biodiversity and management, we get an impossibly large field. That being said, the field is so relatively young, so novel, that if you have 100 or 200 of the key research papers out of maybe several thousand that have been written, you can say that you were in at the ground floor of the discipline. It's that young and manageable. In reality, of course, there are certain topics that have dominated the research of the last decade or so, and that is what we are primarily going to discuss over the coming weeks. In particular, we're going to discuss natural history and ecological science within the city. I want to provide an ecological history of the city, provide an introduction to urban design, think about the biota in cities both in terms of who's who, what those species are, how do we classify them, what are the typical forms, what's rare within a city, but also an overview of where these organisms are found, which translates into a classification of urban habitat. We're going to be looking at cities as systems in a variety of ways, one through the lens of ecosystem theory, asking about how we see cities as ecosystems, thinking about the way in which biodiversity assists in the provisioning of ecosystem services. We also want to look at cities through the lens of social ecological systems research. This is where there's been a fertile exchange and marriage between the urban social sciences and the ecological ones. We'll spend some time thinking about the connection between biodiversity and human health and well-being. Then We'll spend a week or so on some of the more mischievous species found within cities, everything from rats and lice to earthworms and pesky plant species growing in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'll spend time thinking about restoration ecology and other conservation approaches that are used in the city to protect biodiversity, particularly the rarer elements of the urban biota. We'll wind up the quarter really intensifying our use of Chicago examples, looking at the natural history of Chicago, looking at the history of Chicago wilderness and efforts to protect diversity here. Wrap up the quarter thinking about the future, the evolution of organisms in the city, the future of environmental design, ecological design in the city, and so on. For today, I just wanted to offer an initial provocation, something for us to think about and discuss when we meet on the 18th. And this is based upon a fundamental distinction that's made in urban ecology, an adjacent discipline to the one that we're examining, and that's the distinction made between ecological studies in the city versus ecological studies of the city. Ecological studies in the city are typically built upon single disciplines, very often, not always, but ecological, scientific ecology, studies that are conducted at a relatively small scale, local scale, located within the city, multiple replicates, for instance, within a city. These kind of tend to be the more common studies found, and they often involve the use of the tools, techniques, thinking of natural history. Ecological studies of the city have more of a systems flavor, where the city is regarded from an interdisciplinary perspective, marrying the social and ecological sciences, often along with perspectives drawn from the humanities. They tend to be multi-scalar, looking at everything from plots to cities themselves to international collaboration across cities and so on. Very often the theme is kind of looking at the relationship between humans and nature in urban settings. These studies are arguably less common, and at least some in the discipline will argue that more of these sort of studies are going to be needed in order to develop and advance this work. Although we will translate the distinction into topics appropriate for our study as we work through the quarter, I want to point out, of course, that we as individuals tend to experience the city on relatively small scales and intimately. I've been interested in this past year or so about the way in which contemporary ecology often loses a sight of the direct connection between our bodies and the natural world. What are we seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling, and so forth? For example, if you look at recent anthologies in natural history and anthologies of research papers in ecology, you often notice the much more prevalent use of references to what is seen in, you kind of will see actually a fairly consistent use of terms associated with seeing things or observing things. But what you find in natural history is kind of a more full-bodied approach to the experience of nature. Naturalists tend to kind of, touch things more, feel things more, often hear things more, and even smell things more, I suppose. And what I am suggesting is, and as I've written, that ecologists are losing their senses. Maybe a contentious point, but for us, what I'm interested in us doing with this is just asking you to pay attention during the quarter to what you are kind of experiencing of the city. Since in the seminar we're taking a fairly cerebral approach, looking at the literature, I also want you to be kind of aware of the fact that you are indeed an organism in a city, and you have this direct experiential, phenomenological connection with the world around you. We'll talk a little bit about mechanisms of incorporating that into our class discussion. A final note for now is that in the class we will be talking about the productive, hopefully, tension between theory and practice in our discipline. But we'll wind up the quarter really thinking about the way in which the theoretical, experimental research approach can inform the practice of management in the city. But moreover, we also want to think about the sort of questions for research that are generated by practitioners and managers as they do their research. Well, that's all I have for you for now. We, as I said, will meet in about a week. The syllabus will accompany this video. Get cracking with some of the readings, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.